Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today's live stream, which is all about editing with black and white. Welcome to those of you who are watching on YouTube or Facebook. If you'd like to interact, you're more than welcome. Then please put your comments in the chat or questions. I will see those and be able to pick out some decent ones. And the same goes for Facebook as well. If you write in the comments, then that will come through to me. If you're in our live streaming room, then you are, of course, very welcome to ask a question there too. If you do, make sure you put that in the Q&A tab. There is quite a lot of you, and if you put it in the chat, it just tends to get lost amongst everything else. Helen is also hanging out on the Q&A as well, so she'll be able to answer your questions as well. As I said, there is a whole bunch of you today, so if we don't get to all of the questions, please don't be offended. We will try and answer as many as possible. If you'd like a bit more space, you can also hit that down arrow and that will give you more capture on real estate as well. Same for you on YouTube. If you want to go full screen, then that gives you a bit more space to see what's going on. So without further ado, today is about black and white. So the mechanics of the black and white tool are actually pretty simple. So we'll start with that just to see exactly how it works. We'll look at some of the further editing you can then go on to do with your photography, and look at a popular technique which I often tend to use with black and white, which is dodging and burning. So selectively brightening or darkening parts of the image. And we look at two ways you can do that. One is a manual way, but maybe slightly more refined or more flexible. And the second is a faster way with style brushes, which gets the job done 90% of the time. But it's nice to see both ways of doing it. And we can look at adding grain and also styles if time allows as well. So let's get into it. We've got this image here, straight out of camera, I think. Yes, straight out of camera. The only thing that's been done to it is straighten because I was obviously not quite with it when I took that picture. So it's been rotated and cropped a little bit, but otherwise straight out of camera. Now in the default workspace, let's just quickly go back to the default workspace for a second. You will find the black and white tool in the adjustments tool tab. So down here at the bottom, black and white tool. A couple of options. I personally find this adjustments tool tab a bit overwhelming. There's too much going on. So I have a customized workspace, or V7 as we're on now, and I have my black and white tool kind of conversely in the color tool tab, which might sound a bit weird, but there is a reason for that as well. So if you find you do a lot of black and white editing, you can either do a couple of things. You can add the color tool tab by clicking on the three dots here and picking up color, and the black and white tool is in there. Or you can make your own custom tool tab and pop the tools in there which you generally use for black and white editing. Now that might vary between all of us, but for me that tends to be obviously the black and white tool, the curves tool, clarity, those kinds of things. But I am pretty content with just having the black and white tool here. So, but otherwise you'll find it in your adjustments tool tab. So the basics are, if you want to start editing in black and white, you first need to enable the black and white tool. Now this is representing you the image in black and white. Conversion is maybe not the right word because we've still got the underlying color image now being represented as black and white. And what this means is that we can use certain color tools, and it also explains why we have these 6 color channels, if you like, here as well. And what these sliders do is simply brighten or darken the specific tone. So if we think about blue, rather obviously the sky is blue. So if I drag the slider in this direction, then the sky is going to get darker. If I bring it up in this direction, then it's going to get brighter. So pretty easy to understand. So if I want a moodier sky, I can bring that down. If I go back to the top, red slider on this train, that was kind of orangey. So I imagine there's a mix. So there's some red in there, so I can brighten that up a tad. Yellow, we've probably got some in the ground at the front, like so, and green, maybe not a lot because it was very dry and burnt. Cyan is often present in the sky, so you can see that has an effect as well. Blue we already looked at. Magenta, maybe not a great amount going on here. So really it's a very unscientific process of adjusting or making that first step, but it gives you the opportunity to brighten, darken those tones in the picture. If we take something which is very monochromatic, let's just crop in on this for a shot for a second, and we enable black and white, we're not going to see a great deal of movement in the image based on these sliders because we don't have a lot of these various different colors. So if I drag blue around, there's a little bit of a change on the windows, but nothing super dramatic. Green, very little. There's a tree over here, which gets edited, but otherwise not a great deal. So the effectiveness or what's going on with those sliders is going to vary based on the image content. So if you remember, I said this is a representation of what the image will look like in black and white. It's not necessarily a conversion. We're not throwing away color data or anything like that. So it does mean that if you use a tool like the color editor, it's also going to have an impact on the photo. So if we click on the sky as an example, we can also change the density of the sky because it's blue, and we're changing the blue channel. So it doesn't render any color tool ineffective. You might have to remind yourself just by turning black and white off exactly what color tones you have in the image before you go ahead and use the color editor. But it is perfectly possible to use the basic tool, advanced, and even the skin tone tool as well. So don't forget that. So it's not really a conversion, it's a representation of how the image will look in black and white. We'll come back to this one in a second, but if we just tweak something else, what should we grab? No, let's actually continue with this one. So as we go through some other edits, we're always going to start at this point, and it's going to vary each time we do it. So let's continue on with this one. So mechanics of the black and white tool, very simple. So what further editing can we do? Well, this is pretty straightforward, to be honest, because all of the tools that you're used to using for color images work in pretty much the same way as they do for black and white. Not really a great deal of difference. What I would begin to look for in an image like this is that now I've got how I think the black and white conversion would look, then we go on into a normal editing process. But that doesn't mean we can't return to the black and white tool and refine it if need be. So looking at this, whoops, go away Wacom, I would first of all consider this to be a little bit on the dark and muddy side. Again, depending what look you're going for. And looking at our histogram, you can see we don't have a great deal on the tonal range up from the 3/4 tones to the bright tones. So we could lift up our exposure, brighten it up a bit. Maybe not by that much around here. The only thing I'd be conscious of is that we do have, just peeking behind, this was at Bonneville salt flats, and there is large amounts of salt behind the train, and I wouldn't want that to get too bright because it's kind of not in the middle of the shot, but it would be very distracting if this was super bright. So for me, a combination would be a bit of exposure and also some brightness. And worth remembering, or making the point once again, as I always do, the brightness slider has less of effect on the highlights. So what the brightness slider is doing is kind of taking those midtones and pushing them to the right a bit and having far less effect on the highlights. Whereas the exposure tool takes the entire tonal range and brightens everything. So any areas that are particularly bright might get too bright. So balance between brightness and exposure is very useful. So now we're a bit brighter. Going to look to the levels tool. Going to hit auto on the levels, and that's going to essentially take this value at the bottom. So what is it, 230 on the RGB scale, and remap it or stretch it out to 255. So imagine just grabbing either ends of the histogram if it's a physical thing, and stretching it out along the tonal range, which is generally what we want to have an image which has nice amounts of, I don't know why Wacom has started doing that, nice amounts of contrast and so forth. Now, if we look at our histogram, there is a tiny, extremely tiny little blip there, which could be this potentially getting too bright. So if you look at those numbers, 252, 253, 254. So it's fine right now, but I'm just going to keep an eye on that. If I'm worried, I could just tweak this out ever so slightly. And now we're probably back to a more comfortable range. There we go. All right. Finally, using the other tools that we know and love, I would add a little bit more contrast, keeping an eye that we're not clipping any shadow detail, and add some clarity. And clarity, if you're unsure, adds contrast but focused on the midtones only. So it's going to be careful with bright areas like this, and careful with, you know, our darkest tones, which are kind of just sitting down under here. Excessive contrast would render this into complete black, which we don't want as well. So as a very simple, nice, basic black and white conversion, I'd be pretty happy with that. I might just build in, you know, a little bit more contrast. I'm going to take the exposure down a nudge rather. Black and white tool, as I said at the start, if you want to go back and finesse this, we can a little bit. So I might take the blues down a touch more, like so, just a smidge. Looking at before and after, that's how he came out of the camera, and then that's our conversion, like so. So it's pretty simple to get nice black and whites without really a huge amount of work, but that important first step into showing or representing the image as black and white, manipulating those sliders, and then go on to do your, you know, normal edits if you like. Let's see what we've got in the questions. Helen's been very busy already. Thank you, Helen. A couple of questions which came up earlier, and also I know a couple of you are working with monochrome cameras like the Leica Q. You don't have to do this first step because it's already represented in black and white. So you can ignore that and just move on to, you know, the next step and all the other things we're going to do today as well. Let's see. A couple of people talking about a black and white scanned image. That's a good question. So I haven't had much experience of working with negatives. I think something I need to look into a little bit before offering advice, but maybe we can do a session one day on working with scans. Han says he can see some banding in the sky. I can't. It's probably just compression from the live stream, I would say. So looking on my monitor, I imagine you're looking up in this area. It's banding free, but on the live stream, obviously it has to compress the data down a little bit, and that's an area which would probably get a little bit of banding going on, but it's clear on my monitor. Jim says, need a bit of dodging and burning. We're going to come to that, Jim. Don't worry. So this is our basic simple edit. So we're going to build it up slowly. All right. Okay, let's do another one, which is maybe a little bit different. So let's go back to Matera. So I'm just going to reset this as it came out of camera. So the goal of this shot was really to show, you know, the busyness of the streets below. And as a color image, it's a bit kind of boring. To be honest, it's really uninteresting and difficult exposure. It's at sunset, so the buildings are in shadow, so the sky is kind of a bit blown out and uninteresting. So it's a bit kind of dull as a color image as it is. But I thought, would it be nice to try and represent the compactness of this ancient city and just how much, you know, life and architecture is kind of built on top of each other. So I wanted to crop in tighter to something like that. Now the issue with it still as a color image, and again we could probably get around it with editing, is that it's not much three dimension to it. It's very flat and uninteresting. But there's loads of great architectural details. We've got tiles, we've got you know, the various different wall coverings, different textures, different colors, all that kind of stuff. Foliage growing out the walls. It's yeah, it's a fascinating place to look at, but again it's still a bit two-dimensional and flat. So my hope was, as a black and white picture, we'd be able to see this kind of architectural interest. So before anything else, I'm just going to, with the keystone sliders, just tweak the keystoning a little bit, because we do have a little bit of I don't want to completely correct for it, but I think I can flatten it off a little bit. And if you were around last week, we spoke extensively about sharpening, diffraction correction, and so on. I know that this lens sensor combination at f8, diffraction starts to creep in. So I'm going to turn on my diffraction correction up here to correct for that. And we're going to go ahead and check on enable black and white and see what happens. Now, as I briefly mentioned earlier, not a lot happens when we play around with these sliders. We had some bit of greens going on with just the foliage there, but it's not even worth worrying about. Yellows, again, this one I might pull up a bit, because you can see we start to get a little bit of separation in the tones in the building. So I'm going to brighten that a little bit. And probably for everything else, funnily enough, if I change the blue, if we zoom into some windows, you can see it has an effect on the blinds in the windows. So I don't know if dark or bright helps. I'm actually going to go dark, somewhere in between. So we've got our basic corrections going on. And now I want to build in some contrast. Now, looking at this histogram, it's a typical, if you like, histogram representing a flat image. So it's got very little, my God, I must have changed something on my Wacom that keeps bringing up the contextual menu. I need to look into that. Let's see. Weird, it's normally like one of the touch buttons that brings it up, but I don't know, it's a mystery. Anyway, so normally we can see we've got no highlight detail, pretty much non-existent, not much going on in the shadows, big hump in the middle, meaning most of our tonal range is mid-tone. Effect of that is that it's very flat, boring and uninteresting. So density-wise, I'm just going to bring up the brightness a tad and go straight away to levels and hit auto. And again, what this will do is bring those black and white points in. So if we reset that and hit auto again, already we get, you know, a massive improvement of separation between those bright and dark areas, but it could still do it with a little bit more. So we could use our contrast slider, but quite often with black and whites, I prefer the extra control that the curve tool gives us. Handy preset, which you might not have noticed, is that up here we've got a 5-point all channel preset. You'll see if I hover over that, it just locks you 5 points on the curve. So rather than having to add points and manipulate them, we've got 5 lock points at, you know, kind of popular areas of the curve, if you like. So to increase contrast, we just do our standard S curve, and then we can fine tune a little bit. So making the shadows a bit darker, the mid-tones also a touch darker, and then the 3/4 tones a bit brighter as well. So if we option click on our reset button, we can see before and after, like so. So quite a nice punchy difference. Now we can start to see the busyness of the street scene below us, if you like. There's a lot more separation going on. And we can also, you know, if this was printed and we were looking fairly close up to it, we can just see the level of detail and all the different, you know, aspects of life going on and so forth. As I like the fact that we've got all these different textures and so on, I would also put in some structure, which is almost like a contrast adjustment, but just at micro pixel level. So let's bump this up. And I also wouldn't be afraid to put a bit of extra sharpening, because I know this quality of this file is really good, even though it's an APS-C camera, Fuji X-H2. It's got a really nice, decent quality lens on it, so we can pull out a lot of that detail without it messing up. So there we go. That was something I was looking for, as opposed to, if we look at the before, bit of a mushy kind of color representation. So as I said, don't be afraid to use the curves. And also, secondly, if you've used a curve but you think, you know what, maybe it's just the shadows are a bit too dark or the highlights are a bit too bright, don't be afraid to go back and use these sliders. Just because you've used a curve doesn't negate the fact that you can also manipulate using the sliders. So I might pull the whites down a little bit and also the highlights a touch, just so this is not as bright as it was before, like so. Awesome. Let's see, Barry said, for intentional high contrast images, would you crush the blacks? If so, would you use the curves tool? You know, I'm always a little bit wary of completely crushing the blacks, and what Barry means is by doing something like, you know, that sort of, I mean, I'm exaggerating, Barry, I know you didn't exactly mean that, but I think you can still get a contrasty image without having to do that. So if we look like down here, now that we've clipped this data, do you see what's happened to the histogram? We've got a lot of shadow down here, if we zoom into a stupid amount, with absolutely no data in it whatsoever. I'm personally not a fan of that because I think it's almost a bit too ugly to look at. Your eyes tend to latch onto those extreme dark areas. So I would just be a little bit wary of having those, you know, extreme clipped blacks, if you like. So if you wanted to have intentional high contrast, I would still be a little bit mindful. Like if we wanted to have more contrast, we could do so, carefully pushing and just keeping an eye on this. So we're all right at the moment. If we turn on exposure warnings, there's nothing which is alarming me, but we can have, you know, even contrastier image. Just be careful of this. But if we go into that super dark area again, so around here as an example, look at our numbers. We've still got some data in there, but it's not down to 0. So it's still pretty dark. So I think you can achieve that high contrast look, but whenever you cut into the histogram like that, it tends to look a little bit ugly. Can you do a black and white adjustment on a layer? Sadly not, no. It's one of the tools, or one of the few tools, that does not work on a layer, unfortunately. Maybe that's something that can change in the future, but currently it does not. 5-point curve, yeah, good question. So how do we get that? It's just a preset. So it's a built-in preset. So 5-point curve, you can just pick it up here. So if we go back to the train and we choose it here, 5-point all channels, it doesn't change anything when you apply it. It just locks in those 4 points at popular spots. So rather than you having to actually create them, they are already there. Again, if we wanted Barry extreme high contrast, we could push this pretty hard without actually having or losing any data in those extreme shadow areas. So we've still got 10 points there, which is still pretty dark. It's going to print pretty dark, but it's not devoid of data. Good question, Recanto. Is it better to do the conversion to black and white first and then make general adjustments, or the other way around? I would say do your black and white conversion first, because if you take a color image, sometimes it works. Of course, I don't have a color image here, but if I just turn this off for a second. So let's say this is your color conversion, which it probably is. There's nothing to stop you thinking, oh, I wonder if this will look nice in black and white. So my advice would be to clone it. So we've ended up with all the same adjustments, turn on black and white and see what you think. Actually not bad. So doesn't mean to say that you can't do that. But if you're looking at an image and thinking, I want this to be a black and white, I would start with that black and white process, as I mentioned. All right. Gosh, lots of questions. Good one from Mark I'll pick out. What's the benefit of using Luma versus RGB? That's actually a really good question. And we can mention it. Let's mention it with this one, as there's some color in there. So the reason that I tend to use Luma as opposed to RGB, and it could be pedantic. So I'm very open to you calling me out on this. But let's say you've gone through the black and white tool and you've done some pretty, careful adjustments with the black and white tool. So let's tweak this one like so. So you've gone through, you've tweaked, and you're pretty happy with how your representation of those different color tones is looking in black and white. And you've then decided, you know what, I'd like to have some more contrast. Let's just see if there's any. Let's take clarity off here. There's no contrast. So you're thinking it's a bit flat. I want to build in some extra contrast. Now the danger is, and again, I could be being pedantic, the danger is with an RGB curve is that with an RGB curve, obviously not that dramatic, with an RGB curve, you actually change the saturation of the image as well. Like if you've applied an S curve, then your saturation is going to go up, and then it may also affect how these sliders are representing. Because if you think if red saturation has gone up and you've adjusted the red in this way, it's actually going to have a greater effect. So to keep the colors stable, if you like, I tend to use a luma adjustment because we're adjusting a black and white image essentially. So all I'm wanting to do or wanting to achieve is manipulate luminosity. Now at the end of the day, I can still do that with an RGB curve. So there is a level of pedantry that goes in with this, but I just feel more comfortable using the luma tab of the curve tool because it is pure luminosity values then. So go with that. I mean, there's no disadvantage to going with the luma curve. I think it just separates it out nicely from color adjustments. Okay, let's put this back and then we're going to talk about looks, checks, notes, as though he's confident like I knew what we were going to talk about. We're going to look at dodge and burn. So let's take this and make sure I don't have a layer on there already. I do, so we're going to delete that. So this obviously has already been converted to black and white. And quite often, and not just in black and white photography, color photography as well, quite often you can't make an edit to an image where the adjustments you've made satisfy the whole content. So in this particular case, I'm happy with what's going on here, and I'm happy with what's going on here, but it's a bit too bright in the center, as you can see. So it's, the highlights are a little bit bright, she's a bit too bright. I'd just like to take this down a little bit, but I don't want to affect anything else. So we've got two different ways to do this. We can do the long-winded way, but enables us to build a set of adjustments that are particularly well suited to that picture, or we can speed it and go with style brushes. Both have their place, but it's nice to show you both options. So first of all, let's go for the longer, more precise process. So we're going to start with making a new filled adjustment layer. So that's a layer over the whole picture. So if I press M on my keyboard, the mask is represented in red. So whatever I do now is going to affect the entire image. But the reason why we're doing it on the entire image is so I want to dial in the adjustments that look good. So really all I'm looking at here is this central part. So I think it's too bright. So we're going to make it a little bit darker, like so. I'm going to pull the highlights down. Going to open the shadows a touch, so it's not too dark. Again, I don't care what's happening here or here. I'm essentially looking just in the middle, and I'm going to add a bit of extra clarity as well. And perhaps also a bit of structure, because I don't think I added any structure on the background. Nope, because a lot of it is moving. So there's no point adding structure here because it's blurry. It's just going to accentuate the movement. But here, it could actually be nice to have some structure. So I'm going to dial that in there as well. And maybe even a little tickle of extra sharpness. So I'm happy with those edits in the middle, but I only want it to be applied in the middle. So let's just name our layer so we know what is going on with that. sorry, center. And what we need to do is right click and clear the mask. So this is going to get rid of the mask, but those underlying tweaks that we've just made are still going to be present. And then we can brush those, excuse me, back in where we wish. So let's clear that mask, grab my brush, and talk about this flow. So if I have my flow set to 100, let's just make this brush a bit softer. If I have my flow set to 100, as soon as I start brushing or drawing with the mouse, it's going to throw in all those adjustments in one hit, which I might not want, to be honest. I want to control how much it builds up. I might want to apply a bit more of the layer in some areas than others. So let's right click and clear that mask again and talk about this flow. So bring this up. So flow is pretty important, because if we drop this flow down, so let's go to around 5, what it means, regardless of whether you're using a pen or a mouse, it doesn't matter. But what it means is that having a low flow allows you to build up the adjustment gradually. So as I brush back and forth on any given part of the image, it's going to build up my layer center. So this one over here, it's going to blow up. It's going to build up that layer gradually in short increments of 5%, essentially. So it means we can carefully brush in those adjustments and stop when we feel there's enough. So if I start just brushing around here, you can see what's going on with the Wacom as well. Then I can slowly build up the adjustment. I don't want much going on this bar here, so I'm going to skip that and just place it down here. Don't really need any down here because it's blurry anyway. So I'm just applied it to those areas. Now you might think, well, you haven't done anything, it looks the same, but remember it's building up very slowly. So if we turn off the center layer, then you can see before and after. So it's just subtle, but exactly what I wanted to achieve, just to balance it out a bit. Now if you feel you've gone too far, don't forget you've got an opacity slider. So the opacity of how much of this layer you want to see. So if we pull opacity down to 0, we've got none of that adjustments. 100, we've got all of it. Somewhere in between, we can dial it back a little bit. So if we look at the mask represented in grayscale, so that's going to hide the image and just show me what the mask looks like. So black is no mask. White is the full strength of whatever this layer is, up to that opacity. So down here, we've got less of my adjustment layer being present. We've got more here, a little bit less there, and more there. So it means that your ability to finesse that adjustment that's coming in is, enormous. So rather than just splatting in the entire adjustment, you're able to just gradually build it up as you wish. What features do I like on the Wacom tablet beyond using a mouse, I assume, Brian? Lots of things, actually. You know what? I haven't used a mouse for centuries, showing my age. And the reason for that really is just ergonomics. So here's a mouse, which you know and well. I don't particularly like holding a mouse for long periods. I just don't find it comfortable. Back in the day when Apple made a really stupid mouse, which was circular like a hockey puck, and it would kind of gradually turn its way, around during the day until you had this claw hand with, arthritis and everything. It just simply wasn't comfortable. So I find it just much nicer using a pen. And of course, when you're dodging and burning, you're essentially drawing on a canvas. So I find it's much nicer, to draw. You can change direction really quickly, much faster than being able to do so with a mouse. So I just much prefer it. You've still got buttons on it. You've still got a right click down here. A right click. You've got 2 buttons actually. So this one for me acts as a right click, this top button. And then the one at the bottom here for me acts as scroll. So if I click and hold this button here, then I can scroll on a web page in Capture One or whatever. So I don't miss anything. a tool from a mouse. Probably the first time you use it, it will drive you insane, and then you'll wonder how you ever live without it. So there's definitely a transition period. All right, couple of useful checkboxes here. We'll talk about brush with layer in a second, but eraser with brush, this means it links the eraser to the eraser to the same setting. So let's say, well, here for example, I just brushed over in this area which I didn't want. If I go and choose my eraser, it has exactly the same size, hardness, opacity and flow as the brush because I've checked this box on. So if I want to kind of back and forth between brushing adjustments in and taking them out, it's very easy to go to, brush, add some adjustments in. Actually, I don't want it up here, so I'm going to choose my eraser and then just take them out. So yeah, that's a really handy little checkbox, which I'm not so sure if it is on by default. So just have a look, because I would always recommend having that on. Brush with layer we'll look at in a second. So that's the long-winded way. So make a filled layer, add the adjustments that you want to happen for a particular part of the image, clear the mask, and then brush it back in with a low flow. So just remember, on this layer, it can be a combination of a whole bunch of different stuff. It doesn't have to be one adjustment. Like you saw here already, it was, now my Wacom doesn't want to scroll, of course. There we go. It was some exposure, it was some highlight, there was some shadow, there was a bit of clarity in there was some sharpness and so on. A whole lot of stuff which benefits that area of the picture, but nowhere else. So it can be, pretty extensive. But what about if we wanted to use something else? So let's go back to Wyoming for a second, more Monroe, and let's take out those two layers that we did earlier. And then what we have is a tool called Style Brushes. Now by default, you'll find this in the Adjustments tool tab, but I have made my own custom tool tab, like so, and just added the Layers tool by right-clicking and choosing that tool down here, and also the Style Brushes tool. So I've got a Style Brushes tool tab, essentially. So we've got our picture and we're thinking, let's do a little bit of dodge and burn. I know someone was keen earlier. Who was that? That was Jim. Let's do a bit of dodge and burn. Now we could do it the way we did before, or we could use the very handy style brushes. And this works obviously for color photography too as well. I think this would be maybe very applicable for the Leica Q monochrome owners, who maybe have less opportunity to manipulate color tones in the picture with the black and white tool, because it will have no effect. So they might like to use dodging and burning just to selectively brighten, darken bits of the picture. So let's say I wanted to dodge, which in old school terms was to brighten. So if I click on the dodge style brush, instantly the brush tool is chosen. If I go onto my picture, you can already see that the brush has been set up for certain parameters. Doesn't mean you can't change it. And I am just going to dodge or brighten just up in the peak of the roof here, because it's a little bit hidden, and also down here under the eaves, a little bit there as well, and so on. Now again, you might not think anything has happened, but if we turn dodge off, you can see before and after, like so. Quite often with dodging and burning, it doesn't have to be an enormous amount. It can just be a few little quick treatments like that. Can just make all the difference to a shot. So don't be afraid to do it. So that action of clicking dodge and then drawing immediately on the image does a whole load of automatic things. So it selected the brush for us, it made a new layer, it built the various adjustments into that layer, which we can see, it's not a secret. So for the dodge layer, opens up exposure by 0.2, and it also adds a little bit of an RGB curve like so as well. What we do, brightening, so I could just brighten a few bits along the roof here like so, kind of following what's there, but just to add a bit of contrast. If it's happening too fast, couple of things we can do. We can go back to the eraser and just erase what we've done, or we could go in and take the flow down a little bit and so on. Let's say we want to use another style brush, same as before. We can grab burn, and then we can do the opposite, which will just darken like so. If we've overbrushed a little bit, if I just grab the eraser and just go along that line there. See, just doing this with a mouse would be quite clunky. I think it's hard to use a mouse in different directions, as it were. So now we've done some dodging and burning. Simple. If that's too much, we can just take that opacity down a little bit like so. Other tick box. Brush with layer. So this means as I switch layers, let's just make the brush super big on this layer for a second. As I switch layers, so I'm on my burn layer, it's relatively big. If we go to the dodge layer, it will automatically switch back to the previously used brush size. So if you're working with a whole stack of layers, so you don't have to keep changing and tweaking your brush settings, it will just automatically do that for you. That's a big time saver, but it relies on this checkbox being on, this one here. So make sure that's on. Handy tip for brush size or shortcut. So if you hold down Control Option and just click drag left and right, that will change the size of the brush. If you go up and down, that will change the hardness. So incidentally, the reason why there's two concentric circles is the one in the middle is where the brush is at 100%. By the time it's reached its second concentric circle, it's faded to 0. Go away. So yeah, handy hint, Control Option, drag left and right or up and down. If you're on a PC, Control Alt, and you need to right click at the same time. Just a technical difference between Mac and PC for some reason. So right click to be able to do that. But it's much quicker. Like if I was, dodging and burning this, for example, let's just do a really bad example. If I wanted to do the mountains or the sky in the background a little bit like this, I might prefer to use, a big brush. If I was doing something like up under the eaves here, I'd want a smaller brush so I can very quickly with that shortcut shrink it down and then open. Oh, I was darkening. Let's dodge in there for a second, shrink that down and then open that up. So you might just find that shortcut is much, much easier. Nice. Okay, let's pull that out. Question from Chili. Sorry I got on late. Minus points for you. Do you have any true monochrome images you can demo on an M10M? You know what, I might have, but I don't have in this particular session. But to be honest, there isn't anything special that you need to know. You're just cutting out a step. You don't need to do this because it will have no action, to be honest. So you're doing everything after that point. The benefit you've got, of course, is that quality is, pretty outstanding. The camera hasn't had to interpolate anything, so it's likely you'll get really nice pixel acuity. But things with dodging and burning, contrast, clarity, it's all exactly the same. There's not really anything you need to relearn for an M10. How are we doing for time? Pretty good. So that's style brushes. Really handy. Don't forget you can make your own style brushes. So if we just go back to the train as an example, if you wanted to save that as a style brush, everything on this layer into a brush, you can go into your style brushes and say save. And then it will say, hey, on this layer, you've got exposure, shadows, highlights, sharpening, clarity, structure. And do you want to save all those various brush parameters too? And then you can save that and you've got yourself a custom style brush. So don't forget to do that. There are some other really handy default ones like shadows recover. So that will simply just do that, allow you to pull out a bit more from the shadows. I should have brought another sample image with me, which I didn't do, which I meant to do earlier, but let's just grab it here. So if I do shadows recover and then brush in this area, that's just going to open up the shadows gradually, as you can see. So if you want some fine control of being able to see into the shadows, then that's actually a really nice style brush to play around with as well. Same for highlights recover. Oh, we're going to do that on the shot on the next one. Brightness plus just adds brightness on the slider. Brightness minus reduces it. Contrast plus and minus does the same thing. Dodge we looked at. Adding haze and removing haze with the dehaze tool, recovering highlights or brightening highlights, and shadows darken and recover. One that I like to have, I don't know if it's here actually, clarity plus. So just a brush to add clarity locally, because sometimes we don't want to do it too heavily in some areas, because sometimes we can get halos around the sky. So if I just wanted to add clarity to the mountainscape, then I could get myself a bigger brush and then just brushing clarity where I wanted to have it, which can be really nice, especially if you want to have a softer sky. Now, I'd spend a bit more time maybe doing that a bit more accurately, but you get the idea. When you convert to black and white, can you use white balance? You can. I don't tend to. It will still have an effect on the photo, but I don't tend to play with it after that. You can do, which is quite interesting, you can use the color balance tool as well, because you've still got a color image. So if we come out the layer, actually, David, if we go to the background, you can actually triple tone with this. So if I wanted to have, you know, cooler shadows and warmer midtones, then we could do so. So the color balance tool, you can actually do some really cool stuff with on a black and white picture. Split toning is similar, but it probably less flexible, because you can only do highlights and shadows. So here you can do shadows, midtones, and highlights, but essentially you're saying, I want my shadows to have X and X tone, and I want the saturation to be this much. I want my highlights to be this, and the saturation to be this much. Look at that! How amazing does that look? But you get the idea. But I prefer to do it with the color balance tool, which is super nice actually. And you could put that on a layer, because you are playing with the colors in the image, not actually manipulating the black and white representation. So if I did a new filled adjustment layer, then we could pull out the color balance tool and use that as well. So you can do, you know, really nice looks actually with the color balance tool. Very nice. So yeah, do have a play with that, and you could put that on a layer, because then you could adjust the opacity and decide, you know, just how much you want going on there as well. If you are way more knowledgeable than me about older print processes, you could probably spend some time and mimic some of those older print processes, which have different, you know, color tones in them as well, but it can work very, very nicely. All right, let's have a look at film grain in a second. We're going to reset that back to its color component and start again. Helen, you're doing a fantastic job answering 5 million questions. Yeah, Simon, that's probably a good topical one to pick up on. Are halos on high contrast areas typically a function of too high clarity? Generally, and you'll see it on things like that skyline, where you've got, you know, light behind dark or whatever. If you go a bit nuts with the clarity, you can sometimes see a halo, which is why often it's nice to be able to, you know, apply it on a layer to areas that really need it. Is auto white balance best for black and white, or will a fixed value be better for camera settings? I mean, I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you've got something which requires a massive amount of correction for white balance, I would kind of get it roughly in the ballpark. But for an image like this, if I was going to black and white, I wouldn't even bother tweaking the white balance, to be honest. Maybe that's lazy on my part, but yeah, I wouldn't personally worry about it too much. Okay. Lots of questions again. Sorry we can't get through all of them. So what we're going to do with this, I wanted to show you this one for film grain before we run out of time. Before we do this, I am going to correct for keystoning automatically. So I'm going to pick the vertical and horizontal option and click auto. And Capture One has found those lines, which I'm more than happy with to take that. And then I'm going to crop out the drain pipe so I find it a bit distracting. And we're going to focus on our gentleman, who's actually moving at pretty good speed because he's blurry, even though he's on crutches. And Diego up on the wall there. So we've got our cropping. Would I do anything else to this further before going to black and white? Nah, let's go straight to a black and white conversion. Like so. And then we know this image is a bit more populated with color, if you like. So these are likely to have a bit more of an effect. I mean, the blue is probably going to tweak his jacket, so I don't want to make that too dark. So let's go to here. Yellows, I think on the wall we had a bit of yellows. I might brighten that because that gives us some contrast. Red, got to be careful in the hallway. If I make the red too dark, we're going to lose detail here. Cyan, a little bit in his coat once again. Blue, oh, we tweaked that already. That was his jacket. And magenta, not much going on. So got our base adjustments there. It's a bit flat for my liking. So looking at our levels, it's maybe a tad too dark, but not excessively. So let's just bring up the brightness a bit and see what we can do with auto levels. There we go. We might deal with the brightness on his trouser leg with a style brush in a second, but as we go for an almost there adjustments, let's put in some clarity too. I'm happy with that. But the purpose of this shot was to look at the grain tool. Now, if you haven't discovered this or shied away from using it, I would thoroughly recommend that you give it a chance. And if this is an action that you don't want to do to your raw file, because let's say you're going to go to Photoshop, maybe do some manipulation, composite work or whatever, and you don't want the grain there, that's fair enough. But bring the TIFF or Photoshop file back into Capture One and then use the grain tool. That's totally acceptable. So if you don't want to deal with retouching a grainy picture, then do it on your final image as well. So let's zoom in, look at Diego and our gentleman here. So the difference with this grain tool compared to other applications is that generally other grain simulations just rely on sticking an overlay of some kind of scan of a film on top of the image and that's it. That's not very representative of how grain looks in the real world. So this is mathematically modeled grain that knits and interacts into the image much nicer because the grain pattern or the way the grain represents varies a little bit depending whether you're on shadows, midtones or highlights. So the grain is actually very natural. So I'm going to grab a tabular grain, which is more like a tri-X kind of thing. Impact is how visible the grain is, like an opacity almost. Granularity is how grainy it is. So I'm going to go for a fairly aggressive one and go for that. And then you can see our lovely grain pattern looks pretty nice as well. Very, very accurate of the real thing, not just the same old grain pattern slapped on top of an image. Somebody asked this morning, does sharpening make the grain go sharp? And no, it doesn't, because it's almost like a separate layer of the image. So if I grab the sharpening and boost this up, notice how the grain structure doesn't change a great deal. So elements of the picture get sharper, like if you look at the lines on his hat, if I just go a little bit crazy, you can see that gets sharper, but we're not sharpening grain, if that makes sense, because that would look really ugly. So you've got loads of different grain types. You've got some presets here that you can experiment with. There's no right or wrong way to use it. So just experiment. So impact, the opacity, granularity, how much grain you've got, settle on something that you think works with the picture. No need to get overly scientific about it. Why should I use graining? Up to you, creative effect. I mean, we spend loads of money on cameras which have amazing noise reduction and super clean images, and then we go and stick grain on them. So yeah, but that's the way it is. And it does look nice. You can't deny that a well-structured grain effect can look really nice on some pictures. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a bit bothered by the highlights on the back of its legs. So I think this would be nice for a highlights recover brush. down here. So I'm going to make this obviously a bit smaller and then just brush on the back of his leg and on the back of his hat like so. I'm not bothered about being accurate because it's a targeted adjustment. It's only adjusting highlights. So it's not going to affect any of the midtones or any of that stuff. It's just purely going to be highlights. So don't get obsessive about, oh, I need to mask this guy to a millimeter around his clothing. You don't, because we are targeting highlights only. It's not an exposure adjustment. Like if we did, I don't know, brightness minus and I just was as sloppy, then it's going to look ugly. But something like highlights is obviously targeted. So if we turn highlights recover off, like so, then it's just taken that down, the brightness on the back of it. If we do, what should we try? Shadows recover and just a couple of swipes of the front of his jacket, then that makes it less obvious that it's brighter at the back, like so. So now I've just opened that up slightly, but I'm going to dial that down a bit. So if we turn off shadows recover, before, after, like so. If you're being pedantic, you'd say, David, you've gone over onto the doorway a bit. So let's just take that out, like so. Remember, in the dark room, we couldn't really precisely mask anything. We could cut out shapes in cardboard, make shapes with our hands and things, but there was no like accurate subject masking or anything like that. And there's no reason why, for the large percentage of time, you would need to do that here as well. All right. So grain, it's dead simple, but remember, don't forget to do it on a PSD or TIFF file if you want to, after you've done stuff in Photoshop. If you're not going to touch Photoshop, then do it on the raw file in Capture One itself. There was a question earlier, is that can you put grain on a layer? And no, you can't. So grain and black and white are background adjustments only currently. But as I said, who knows if that changes in the future. All right, nearly out of time. So what we're going to do is just look at a last few questions. Thanks for helping each other out on YouTube. That's very nice to see. Answering each other's questions takes the pressure off me and Helen. What are the adjustments on my clarity style brush? I'm pretty sure it's just clarity. So if we just go and grab it for a second, let's just, for the sake of it, put some clarity on Diego over here and look at, oh, hang on, that didn't work. Where are you? Clarity. There we go. If we look at this layer, I'm pretty sure the only thing on it, yeah, is clarity, 85 clarity, but the brush is a fairly low flow. So we're not going to wallop in tons of clarity in one hit. We're going to let it build up nice and slowly. Okay, looking over here and Helen's fast fingers, we'll see if there's any common themes that has popped up. Okay, does it matter which film simulation? I think you're talking about Fuji. It's actually worth mentioning because it does behave a bit differently. So let's just clone this one for a second and take off the black and white. So those of you on Fuji, if you're using a film simulation, where's my base characteristics tool? Where did I put that? Here it is. So if you're on a Fujifilm camera and you've shot with, I don't know, say across, like so, then you've already got your black and white image, kind of a bit like a monochrome. So enabling black and white doesn't really give you, a great deal of point, and actually nothing happens using those tools anyway, because the film simulation is, if you like, part of the raw image conversion. So you've already kind of hopped that step, if you like. So if you like to use the Fujifilm sims, that's great. Then there's no need to touch the black and white tool. You just do everything after that. But if you shot in black and white and you want to override that, you can of course go to Provia or whatever the default is, the standard, and then you can use the black and white tool. So it's entirely up to you. So if you are doing black and white, does it matter which film sim you start from? Let's go to something like Classic Chrome. You see it is going to change it a little bit, but I maybe wouldn't get too pedantic about it, to be honest. So we answered that. Would I use the red, green, blue curves instead of the RGB curve? I haven't dabbled in it personally. If you look at the curves and levels masterclass Alex did a couple of weeks ago, you'll see how you can use those channel curves for color grading, but I would not necessarily see a massive benefit into correlating that with a black and white conversion. So yeah, I don't know, but I'd say that's probably getting a bit too into the nitty gritty then, to be honest. I mean, you want to build contrast or reduce contrast in the image. I don't think there would be much need into, you know, going into those different color channels. Michael says, dodging and burning, what's the difference between using it at the full strength and pulling it back with the percentage, or changing the amount in the tool? That's a good question, because if we go back to the train and we look at our grayscale mask, we've got different levels of intensity across that layer. So where it's white, our layer is strong as possible. Where it's black, we've got no adjustments coming through. And where it's, you know, mid-gray, we've got some of the adjustments coming through. So if I just painted that all in max strength and pulled that back, then we've got a linear adjustment over the whole image. But by using a low flow, we can really finesse how much of that layer is applied to our image. So that's a big important difference, I would say. When printing, how much exposure, for example, do you add for printing to take account of the greater dynamic range of the screen? You know what, William? I've got no idea. I'd say if you're printing yourself, it's very much trial and error. So if you're using your own printer, then you'll be able to correlate pretty quickly how good your tonal range on screen is compared to the print. It's going to depend on paper. It's probably going to depend on the kind of process you're using. So I think that's very hard to answer, and you need to do some testing. All right, I want to show you what's coming up. Press the right button, David. Where is it? This one? No, that's from last week. This one. Let's go back a page. Yeah, so there's lots coming up in September. So starting September 12th, Paul Reefer's joining me. You may or may not know, but I went on a trip with him to the USA, and we live streamed from the USA, and we did some, for want of a better word, quick or hurried edits in the moment. So some of those edits have stood the test of time and some haven't. So, you know, when is a final edit final is what we'll be looking at. So often that's a process of going back at looking at what you've done and thinking, my God, what was I thinking? Or actually, that super speedy edit works out right. So that's more of a thought process live stream. September 20th, we're digging into some more complex sides of masking. So refining masks, feathering, using luma masks in combination with other things, color range masks, and so on. So not just drawing basic boring masks, but doing something a bit more into that. And the 28th is about collaboration. So that's obviously, hopefully you'll immediately all think about Capture on Live, but there's also opportunities to collaborate with things like EIP files, whether that's collaborating with client, team member, or whatever, or also collaborating with yourself. You know, if you're using a couple of different systems or want to work with different catalogs, you know, how do you get adjustments and things easily from pillar to post as well. So if you scan that QR code, that will take you to the live stream page, and I would strongly recommend when you are logged in is to hit that follow button, and then you'll get an email notification when there's any changes on that page. So when a YouTube recording has gone up, yes, these are recorded, answering another question, and they go to that live streams page as well. So all the recordings and all the upcoming stuff will appear on that page. So you'll see where it says upcoming edit with black and white, that will quickly at some point this evening or tomorrow change into a YouTube recording as well. So definitely worth following that page. If you don't have the ability to scan a QR code, let's just type it in the chat. support.capture1.com is easy, and then you can just go to the Learning Hub section. But support.capture1.com is the one to remember. So I hope that was useful for you today. You know, there's no real voodoo about black and white conversion. It's just using that black and white tool and getting a good starting point, and then using all the other things you know about image editing to pretty much treat it as a color image. The takeaways really are: use the style brushes if you want, you know, quick results. If you want to really dig into making really specific edits for the image in hand, then the approach we did with this image here makes much more sense, because you can really create a brush specifically tailored to that image. So go for that. There was a question here which I like the little Leica discussion going on YouTube. Is it necessary to use sharpening if I use film grain? That was a question that came up. Yeah, because the film grain, like, let's just go back to the image, because I like that question. So if we just look at this image and we whack some grain on it, for want of a better expression. So let's put some grain on it like so. I still want the underlying parts of this to be sharp. Doesn't make much difference to this because it's blurry, but I would still benefit from having these details as sharp as possible, because grain doesn't necessarily soften everything. So yeah, I would still use sharpening. All right, that was it. End of session. 5 minutes overrun. Sorry if we didn't, you know, be able to answer every single person's question. It's almost impossible when there's 2 of us and 500-600 people to manage. So we do our best. So enjoy your weekend when it comes, everybody, and hope to see you soon. Take care.